One step separates a brake job that lasts 60,000 miles from one that shakes your steering wheel in 6,000. And most mechanics, even professionals, skip it every single time. If you have ever paid for a brake job and felt pulsation in the pedal a few months later, this is exactly why it happened. Your mechanic charged you $300 to $700 per axle and skipped a $15 step that guaranteed you would be back. A do-it-yourself brake job runs about $150 to $300 in parts, real savings, but only when the job is done correctly. The difference between brakes that last and brakes that fail comes down to about 25 minutes of preparation that almost nobody performs. Every brake job starts at the hub. That's the flat metal face behind your rotor, the part nobody sees and almost nobody cleans. Jay Buckley from Bendix Brakes puts it bluntly: it is impossible to achieve correct rotor runout on a dirty hub. Here is why that matters. Modern rotors are built to run true within 0.02 of an inch, about as thick as a sheet of printer paper, but even a nearly invisible film of rust or brake dust on the hub can tilt the rotor off axis. That is called lateral runout. The spec is tight. Most automakers say 0.02 of an inch at the rotor surface is the absolute maximum. If you go over, you are guaranteed to feel it in the pedal. Take the Jeep Grand Cherokee test. With just a bit of rust left on the hub, the dial indicator showed 0.014 inches of runout, 7 times over the limit. That is not a fluke. Brake and front-end magazine and shop case studies confirm that even a speck of debris can add a full 1,000th of an inch. Here is the math. At just 0.003 inches of runout, the high spot on the rotor scrapes past the pads 836 times for every mile you drive. Over 6,000 miles, that is more than 5 million scrapes, each one wearing a groove into the rotor and pad. It does not take long before you get disc thickness variation. 0.0007 inches is all it takes to feel pulsation in the pedal. Most drivers blame warped rotors, but cast iron does not warp unless you hit 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, way beyond anything street brakes ever see. The real culprit is this invisible layer of rust multiplied by every mile. Skip the hub cleaning and you have already baked in the next failure. Slide pins are the silent troublemakers in nearly every floating caliper brake system. If you have ever paid for a brake job, chances are nobody mentioned them. But when those pins seize up, the caliper cannot float, so only one pad does most of the stopping. The other just rides along, barely touching metal. That is how you get the classic one pad to bare metal wear pattern. One side deep into the warning slot, the other barely worn at all. Andrew Markell, director at Brake and Front End, ranks seized slide pins as the #1 cause of uneven pad wear and early failure. It is a $5 tube of silicone or PTFE grease, but skipping it can turn into a $500 caliper replacement or a set of pads ground down to nothing in half the expected miles. The physics are simple. A floating caliper relies on smooth, free movement along those pins. When they dry out or corrode, the caliper clamps unevenly. One pad bites hard, the other barely presses. That means the rotor gets squeezed off center every time you hit the brakes, multiplying the runout you just worked so hard to avoid at the hub. The pedal starts to pulse, the steering wheel shakes, and the pads wear into a wedge. In some cases, the caliper can lock up completely, dragging one wheel and cooking the rotor until it is blue. The right lubricant matters. Petroleum-based grease will swell and crack the rubber boots, letting in water and salt. That almost guarantees corrosion and pin seizure. Only silicone and PTFE-based grease is safe for the job. Use just a thin layer on each pin and inside the boot. Markell's advice is simple. If you see a dry pin or torn boot, do not just slap on new pads. Clean, inspect, and re-lube every time. It is a 5-minute step that can double pad life and prevent the kind of uneven wear that shops see come back again and again. Skipping it is not just a shortcut, it is a setup for the next failure. Bedding in new brake pads is not some old mechanic superstition. It is the engineering step that locks in the life of your brakes. When you skip it, you are not just missing a smoother stop. You are setting up your rotors and pads for a chemistry problem that no amount of expensive parts can fix. The first few stops after a fresh brake job create a microscopic transfer layer, a mix of iron oxides, baryte, graphite, and carbon that bonds to the rotor face. This layer acts like a custom-fit glove, matching the pad material to the rotor and smoothing out tiny surface imperfections. NRS Brakes calls it the most skipped step in the business, and for good reason. Most drivers just bolt everything together and hit the road. Without proper bedding, you are left with uneven deposits, hot spots, and glaze. The telltale sign is a patchy gray or blue film on the rotor, or a glazed surface that feels slick to the touch. Once that glaze hardens in the wrong spots, it is almost permanent. You will need 130 grit sandpaper or a fresh cut to erase it. And if you are using low copper pads as required by the EPA's 2025 rule, the bedding step is even more critical. These newer formulas are less forgiving, and a botched transfer layer means you will be back in the shop chasing noise, vibration, and early fade. Proper bedding takes about 10 minutes. Do a series of moderate stops from 30 to 40 miles per hour, then allow a cooling period. It costs nothing, but skipping it can cost you thousands in comebacks and replacements. That is not folklore, that is physics, chemistry, and real-world shop data, all rolled into one simple, often ignored procedure. Grab an impact gun and you might feel unstoppable, but here is the catch. That tool can quietly ruin every careful step you just took. Joshua Johnson, engineering director at Ingersoll Rand, spells it out. Most impact wrenches crank out 300 to 400 foot-pounds of torque. The spec for nearly every car on the road is usually 80 to 100 foot-pounds. That is not just a little extra muscle. It is enough to deform the hub flange and warp the rotor mounting face, even if everything was spotless a minute ago. Imagine pressing a soda can against a table with a sledgehammer rather than your hand. The metal bends, and it never sits flat again. What does that mean for your brakes? Over-torqued lug nuts clamp the rotor unevenly, flexing the hub just enough to push lateral runout right past that razor-thin 0.002-inch limit. The result is the same kind of pedal pulsation and steering shake you would get from a rusty hub, except this time it is baked in by brute force. Shops see it all the time. A car comes back with complaints, and the dial indicator shows runout that was not there before the wheels went on. The fix is almost laughably simple. Always hand start your lug nuts, then finish with a torque wrench in a star pattern. Take 2 minutes to bring each nut up to spec, no more, no less. Johnson's advice is that if you skip the torque wrench, you are gambling with every mile. That tiny act of precision is what lets all the previous work pay off, instead of getting wiped out by a few seconds with the wrong tool. Brake fluid is the invisible time bomb hiding in almost every aging car. Pete Meyer, a veteran with over 35 years in the field, doesn't mince words. He ranks neglected brake fluid as the #1 mistake, even above bad rotor prep. Here is what most drivers and even seasoned mechanics miss. Brake fluid is hygroscopic. That means it is constantly pulling moisture out of the air even through a sealed system. In just a year, it can soak up 1 to 2% water by volume. That tiny percentage is enough to drop the boiling point by 135 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2% water, fluid that started out safe at over 400 degrees Fahrenheit can now boil at barely 265 degrees Fahrenheit, right in the range of a long downhill stop or city traffic in summer. When the fluid boils, it forms vapor bubbles. Press the pedal, and instead of stopping, you get a soft, sinking feel. Classic brake fade. The scary part is this. About half of vehicles more than 10 years old have never had their fluid changed. With the average car on American roads now clocking in at 12.7 years, that is millions of drivers unknowingly rolling the dice. Meyer's advice is simple. Treat fluid flushes as urgent, not optional, especially before a brake job. Ignoring this step is like skipping the seatbelt. Most of the time you will be fine, until the day you are not. Multiply those missed steps across the country, and the problem balloons far beyond a single shaky steering wheel. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration tracks brake-related defects every year. In 2022 alone, there were 62 separate brake recalls affecting more than 1.8 million vehicles. Dig into crash investigations and you will find that brake defects contribute to around 15% of mechanical failure crashes, thousands of real accidents, not just annoying noises. Shops that skip hub cleaning, slide pin lube, or a fluid flush see a comeback rate as high as 12%, meaning for every job done right, a dozen come back with pedal pulsation, vibrations, or uneven wear. Compare that to the 1 in 12 ratio for full prep shops, and it is clear cutting corners is not just a nuisance, it is a business model that feeds on repeat failures. With the average car on the road now pushing 12.7 years, and half of those cars never having had their brake fluid changed, you're looking at millions of vehicles one panic stop away from a soft pedal or a failed system. The stakes are not measured in parts, but in the sheer scale of preventable risk across families, fleets, and every stretch of highway. A few thousandths of an inch, less than a sheet of paper, decide whether your next brake job feels new or turns dangerous fast. When hub prep costs $15 in 10 minutes, skipping it means gambling with every stop. The smallest details still decide the biggest consequences mile after mile.